different groups of people in this country. I can't tell you how much I sympathise with the way everybody has had to endure this.
January 14th, 2025. Sandringham Estate sleeps under a clear, icy Norfolk winter sky. Temperature dropping to -3 Celsius by 2 a.m. The main house, a sprawling red brick Victorian mansion that has served as the royal family's private retreat for over 160 years, sits in deep, solemn darkness. Only the security lights flicker across the grounds, and a dim glow emanates from the overnight staff quarters in the East Wing, barely cutting through the winter night. King Charles has been in residence for 10 days following the Christmas period, favouring Sandringham's quiet isolation for winter work, reviewing documents, hosting small private meetings, and enjoying the countryside that has always felt more like home than any palace. Queen Camilla is with him, as are a handful of essential staff, 2 protection officers, his private secretary Sir Clive Alderton working late in the study, 3 household staff in their residential quarters, and the estate manager in a cottage about 200 yards from the main house. At 2:47 a.m, a protection officer on exterior patrol notices something strange, a faint orange glow visible through the ground floor windows on the east side near the library. At first, he is puzzled rather than alarmed. Perhaps someone left lights on, perhaps Sir Clive is still working. But the glow grows brighter, intensifying with every passing second, until he realises in horror what he is seeing. Fire spreading at alarming speed through rooms filled with priceless historical artefacts, royal correspondence, and most importantly, sleeping human beings in the quarters directly above. He radios the security command post, calm but urgent, activating emergency codes that trigger full response protocols within 90 seconds. Alarms shriek through Sandringham's corridors, automatic fire suppression systems engage, and protection officers sprint toward the King's private apartments on the first floor. While calling Norfolk Fire and Rescue Service, Charles wakes to alarm bells and the acrid smell of smoke seeping under his bedroom door. Decades of emergency preparedness, the drills all royals undergo for precisely these scenarios, override initial confusion. He rouses Camilla swiftly, and they move toward the door, only to find the protection officer already there, entering without hesitation, insisting they evacuate immediately. The fire is in the East Wing, spreading fast. They must get out, now. Charles urgently asks about staff, Sir Clive, who was working late, and household members whose quarters are in the affected wing. The officer's reply is careful but evasive. Everyone is being evacuated, sir, but you must move now. The King grabs a dressing gown, helps Camilla into hers, and they are escorted through smoke-filled corridors toward the main staircase. The protection officer shields them from the oppressive heat as they distance themselves from the fire's origin. The evacuation is fast, precise, but terrifying. Staff members emerge from various quarters in nightclothes, some coughing from smoke inhalation, all moving toward the front entrance where freezing January air provides shocking relief from the choking heat inside. Charles and Camilla are guided to a Range Rover on the front drive, engine running, ready for emergency departure if the fire threatens to engulf the entire structure. Yet Charles refuses to leave the immediate grounds. He stands outside the vehicle, watching in growing horror as flames leap through East Wing windows, orange and red light painting the darkness. The desperate wail of Norfolk Fire Service sirens carries across the flat countryside, growing nearer by the second. The first fire engines arrive at 3:14 a.m., 27 minutes after the initial discovery, remarkably fast for Ingham's rural isolation, but an eternity when fire is consuming a historic building with people possibly still inside. Crews deploy immediately, establishing water supplies from the estate's emergency systems and attacking the flames that have already broken through the East Wing roof. Charles, in his dressing gown against -3-degree cold, refuses blankets or shelter, standing firm while firefighters battle to save a building his family has owned since 1862. Generations of Christmases, memories, history, all at stake. But people matter more than walls and artifacts. His mind keeps returning to the same question. Is everyone out? Are all staff accounted for? Answers come slowly. Protection officers report the King and Queen are safe. 2 household staff evacuated from ground floor quarters are treated for minor smoke inhalation. The estate manager, responding from his cottage, coordinates with fire services. But 3 remain unaccounted for. Sir Clive Alderton, last seen in the ground floor study near the fire's origin. Margaret Thornton, a housekeeping staff member whose quarters are directly above the library. And James Whitmore, a 28-year-old junior aide also residing in the East Wing. By 4 a.m., the fire is partially contained but still burns fiercely in sections of the East Wing. Fire crews have prevented its spread to the main residence, but the East Wing itself, the historic library, private study and several residential quarters, is being systematically destroyed. Staff huddle in emergency vehicles as Charles remains on the front drive. Camilla beside him wrapped in a blanket, both watching their home burn, while 3 people remain missing. Norfolk police have established perimeter security, preventing unauthorised access and keeping everyone, including the King, at a safe distance from the dangerously weakened structure. At 4:32 a.m., a fire crew searching the East Wing's ground floor finds Sir Clive Alderton, unconscious in a corridor near his study, overcome by smoke and showing severe inhalation injuries and burns from attempting to navigate the fire-filled hallways. Paramedics immediately establish airways, administer oxygen, and prepare emergency transport to Queen Elizabeth Hospital in King's Lynn. Charles is informed that Sir Clive has been found alive, critically injured, bringing overwhelming but incomplete relief. 2 people remain unaccounted for. Somewhere inside the burning building, they are still lost to the flames that have consumed Sandringham for nearly 2 hours. The sun rises at 7:18 a.m. on a scene of devastation. The fire is finally controlled, no longer spreading, but still burning in isolated pockets that crews systematically extinguish. The East Wing is a ruin. Roof collapsed, windows blown out, centuries of history reduced to charred remains. In the cold morning, fire investigators begin the grim work of searching debris for Margaret Thornton and James Whitmore, whose silence has become its own terrible answer. The dawn reveals devastation that darkness had partially concealed in the East Wing of Sandringham House, which has stood for 163 years. Hosting royalty and housing priceless collections, it is now effectively destroyed. Blackened stone walls still stand but gutted, interior collapsed, roof exposing what remains to Norfolk's winter sky. Fire crews continue dampening hotspots, while investigators begin assessing origin and cause. Charles and Camilla are moved to Wood Farm, Prince Philip's final private residence, to rest and receive updates without witnessing the ongoing grim search. But Charles refuses rest, sitting in Philip's study, mobile phone in hand, receiving constant updates, increasingly certain the news will be devastating. The first confirmation comes at 8:43 a.m. Fire investigators searching the collapsed residential quarters above the library have found human remains, a body located in what was once a bedroom. Death likely from smoke inhalation before the roof collapsed. Formal identification will require time, but the location corresponds to Margaret Thornton's assigned quarters. She was 62 years old, had worked at Sandringham for 18 years, and was known throughout the estate for her dedication, warmth, and unwavering professionalism. Charles receives this devastating news while sitting in his father's chair at Wood Farm, and for several long, silent minutes he cannot speak, processing the unimaginable reality that someone died in his home, under his roof. Though he survived, Camilla sits beside him in quiet, the weight of grief heavy in the room, because there are no adequate words to capture this loss. The stark truth hits hard. Their presence at Sandringham, their need for staff and support, directly resulted in someone being in that building when the fire erupted. The second confirmation comes 90 minutes later. James Whitmore's body is found in a ground floor corridor. Evidence suggests he was attempting to reach the exterior door when smoke and flame overcame him. He was only 28, had been with the royal household for 14 months, and was considered a rising talent in the private secretary's office, with a bright future ahead. His parents are being notified by Norfolk police, even as Charles absorbs the shocking reality that another person has died while serving his household, supporting his private retreat at Sandringham, performing their duties when the fire erupted in the early morning darkness. Sir Clive Alderton remains in critical condition at Queen Elizabeth Hospital, having been transferred from emergency treatment to the intensive care burn unit. His injuries are severe. Second and third degree burns covering 30% of his body, severe smoke inhalation, and extensive lung damage. His condition is described as life-threatening, though currently stable. Charles wants to rush to his side immediately, but is advised that Alderton is sedated and intubated, and medical staff need time to assess his condition before permitting visitors. Additionally, the King's presence at the hospital would create security and media complications, potentially disrupting care for other patients. So Charles waits at Wood Farm, helpless, while his most trusted advisor fights for life in an ICU 20 miles away. By mid-morning, the news has begun leaking. Despite palace attempts to control the flow of information, a tragedy of this magnitude involving the monarch's residence cannot remain secret. Norfolk Emergency Services communications leak to the media, and headlines erupt. Fire at Sandringham Estate, King's residence. Hit by early morning blaze, casualties reported. The Palace Communications Office, already understaffed because senior personnel are at Sandringham, struggles to manage the narrative. At 11:30 a.m., they release a brief statement confirming that the fire occurred overnight at Sandringham House, that His Majesty and all royal household members were safely evacuated, but that tragically, 2 staff members have died and another is critically injured. The statement requests privacy for the families of the deceased and announces that all royal engagements are cancelled indefinitely while the family mourns this devastating loss. The release triggers an immediate global media response. Camera crews descend on Norfolk, establishing positions outside Sandringham gates to capture images of the damaged house visible in the distance. Royal correspondence provides context about Sandringham's historical significance and emotional importance to the royal family. Speculation begins immediately regarding the cause of the fire: electrical failure in an aging building, a heating system malfunction in winter conditions, or more sinister possibilities investigators will need to rule out. Yet beneath the speculation lies genuine shock and sympathy. The royal family, and by extension the institution, is suddenly humanized. They have just experienced trauma and loss. 2 people have died serving that family, and a third fights for his life. Prince William arrives at Wood Farm by mid-afternoon, having been notified around 6 a.m. after the immediate crisis was under control. He finds his father, aged overnight, sitting in the cottage that still carries the lingering scent of his late grandfather, processing not just property loss, but the deaths of staff for whom he felt personal responsibility. William embraces his father silently, because no words can absolve the reality. It is not Charles's fault, yet no one could have prevented this tragedy. The words are true, but offer no comfort against the reality that Margaret Thornton and James Whitmore died in a building where they were present solely because the King required staff support. William sits with Charles and Camilla through the afternoon, making calls to coordinate the family response and shielding his father from immediate pressure to issue statements or make public decisions. Princess Anne arrives in the evening, driving herself from Garco Park, entering Wood Farm with characteristic directness, immediately asking what needs to be done. Anne responds to tragedy with action: identify problems, implement solutions, move forward without drowning in emotions that serve no practical purpose. She has already contacted Margaret Thornton's family and James Whitmore's parents, offering personal condolences and assuring them that the royal family will provide every possible support. She has coordinated with Norfolk Police on the investigation timeline and with fire services about when the site will be safe for a thorough examination. Anne is prepared to shield Charles from obligations until he is capable of resuming them, because regardless of titles and protocol, he is her older brother, devastated by the events of the night. The extended family has been fully briefed. Prince Edward, Sophie, and other working royals have cleared their schedules. Prince Harry has been notified in California and has offered to fly immediately if needed. William gently declines, noting that media presence would complicate an already difficult situation, and that his physical presence is not required for the family to know he is supporting them from afar. The focus remains on immediate needs, supporting the families of the deceased staff, ensuring Sir Clive receives the best possible care, determining the cause of the fire, and eventually deciding the future of Sandringham itself. Charles sits in the cottage where his father spent his final years, gazing out at the grounds his family has walked for 6 generations, processing the reality that Sandringham, once a place of private family life away from public scrutiny, is now a site of tragedy that will forever alter how he experiences this home. 2 people are dead, His private secretary clings to life, and somewhere within the investigation that is just beginning, there will be answers about how a building, supposed to be maintained to the highest possible standards, could burn so catastrophically that 2 people could not escape. The king, who sought privacy and peace, instead finds himself confronted with loss and guilt that no amount of royal resources can ease. Margaret Thornton's daughter, Sarah, receives the news at 9:15 a.m. from Norfolk police officers at her door in Norwich. She is 34, a teacher, with 2 young children who adored their grandmother's stories about working at the big house where the king lived. The officers tell her gently that a fire at Sandringham claimed her mother's life due to smoke inhalation. Sarah's world shatters. Her mother, who had called her just the night before to chat about the grandchildren and describe Sandringham as lovely in winter, is gone, dead in a fire while serving people whose wealth and security could not protect her from smoke and flames in a building that should have been the safest workplace in Britain. The grief is immediate and overwhelming, yet underneath it, a gnawing question begins to form. How could this happen? Margaret Thornton was conscientious about safety. She had raised concerns about old wiring in the East Wing, patched heating systems and general maintenance in sections of the house not regularly used by the family. Had those concerns been properly addressed? Had maintenance been deferred because no royals regularly occupied that wing? Had her mother died because cost-cutting or neglect turned a historic building into a death trap? Sarah doesn't voice these questions yet. She is too consumed by raw, overwhelming grief. But they linger, waiting to be asked when the initial shock recedes enough to allow anger to surface. James Whitmore's parents, Richard and Susan, learn of their son's death mid-morning at their home in Hampshire. Their proud parents, who had watched their youngest child achieve his dream of serving in the royal household, are now confronted with unimaginable loss. They had listened to his excited phone calls about working at Sandringham, about the honour of supporting the king's private office, about the historical documents he was helping to catalogue. Now, police officers are telling them that James died in a hallway while trying to escape the fire, that his body has been found, but formal identification is still pending, and that they will be contacted about arrangements once the coroner releases him. Susan collapses to the floor, her legs giving way beneath her. Richard catches her, both of them sinking to the ground together, enveloped by grief so vast that even the police officers standing nearby can do nothing to ease it. By afternoon, both families are being contacted by Buckingham Palace representatives offering support, financial assistance for funeral costs, counselling services, and assurances that the royal family is devastated by the loss. The outreach is well-intentioned, but it feels inadequate against the magnitude of what has occurred. Money cannot resurrect Margaret Thornton. Support services cannot return James Whitmore to his parents. And while the assurances of royal devastation are probably genuine, they cannot change the fact that 2 ordinary people died serving extraordinary privilege, and their families are left with permanent, unfillable holes a void no amount of royal sympathy can ever truly address. Sir Clive Alderton's wife, Elizabeth, keeps vigil at Queen Elizabeth Hospital's intensive care unit beside her husband's sedated, ventilated body, fighting to survive burns and smoke damage that doctors describe as touch and go. She has been married to Clive for 38 years, supporting his royal service through decades of long hours and endless travel. Now she sits beside a bed watching machines breathe for him while his damaged lungs struggle to recover. The King's private secretary is not just an employee. He is Charles's most trusted confidant, the person who manages the daily complexities of royal life with discretion, dedication, and loyalty. Elizabeth knows her husband will be devastated when he wakes to learn that staff members died while he survived, that his escape from the burning building came at a cost measured in other people's lives. By evening, Princess Anne has taken direct responsibility for family liaison, visiting both the Thornton and Whitmore families personally to express condolences and assure them of continued support. Anne's approach to grief is practical rather than purely emotional. She provides her direct contact information, ensures they understand what assistance is available, and commits to transparency regarding the investigation findings once they become available. The families appreciate her straightforward presence, though nothing can make this remotely acceptable. Anne doesn't pretend otherwise. She tells them clearly that 2 people have died in service to her family, that the loss is unacceptable, and that it will be fully investigated. She assures them that the royal family will honour Margaret and James's memories, not just with words, but through genuine, tangible care for those they left behind. At Wood Farm, Charles begins drafting personal letters to both families. This is a task no protocol requires, yet he insists on doing it himself rather than delegating it to staff. The letters are agonizing to write because no words can truly match the reality of their loss. He attempts to express sorrow, honor, and remembrance, knowing that his attempts may still feel hollow. He writes of Margaret Thornton's dedication and warmth, how she made Sandringham feel like a home rather than simply a royal residence. He recalls James Whitmore's enthusiasm, bright mind, and promising future, cut tragically short. He promises that the investigation will be thorough, that answers will be provided, and that their loved one's service will be honoured appropriately. The letters cannot erase grief, but perhaps they offer a small measure of comfort, a recognition that Margaret and James mattered personally to the king. They served not merely as employees, but as people whose loss affects him deeply. William helps his father with the letters, suggesting phrasing and reminding him gently that perfection is impossible when writing about tragedy. Together, they work in the cottage's study, father and son processing loss through the only meaningful action available: acknowledgement, honouring it, refusing to allow protocol and distance to render these deaths impersonal. Catherine arrives in the evening with food from the main house's undamaged kitchen, insisting that Charles eat something even if he has no appetite. Her presence provides quiet support through practical care. In this moment, the family that usually exists under intense public scrutiny is simply a family dealing with trauma and loss through presence, through practical gestures, through the small acts that say, "You are not alone." By nightfall, plans for memorials begin to take shape. There will need to be services for Margaret Thornton and James Whitmore, ceremonies that honour their service and provide closure for their families. The question is where and when. Ingham's Chapel remains undamaged but feels inappropriate given the estate has become a site of tragedy. Westminster Abbey or St Paul's Cathedral would be too grand for two staff members who lived quiet lives of service. Eventually, Anne suggests St Mary Magdalene Church, Sandringham's parish church, where the royal family traditionally worships during their Norfolk stays. It is appropriate, intimate, allowing families to grieve in relative privacy while still acknowledging the royal connection that defined Margaret and James's final years. The date is set for January 25th, 11 days after the fire, enough time for initial shock to subside and for coroner's investigations to release the bodies. The service will be private, restricted to family, close friends, and royal household members. Charles will attend, as will other senior royals, but there will be no press access, no cameras, no transformation of personal grief into public spectacle. This is the family's private mourning for two people who died serving them, and that grief does not require an audience or documentation. Norfolk Fire and Rescue Service investigators spend 4 days examining the ruins of Ingham's East Wing before reaching preliminary conclusions about the fire's origin and cause. The investigation is led by Station Commander Robert Hayes, a 30-year veteran who has examined hundreds of fire scenes, but never one of such historical significance or with such tragic outcomes. His team works methodically through the debris, photographing everything, collecting samples for laboratory analysis, and reconstructing the fire's progression from the point of origin through the building, seeking the crucial evidence that explains how a controlled household environment became a lethal conflagration. By day 2, the origin is identified with reasonable certainty: a ground-floor room near the library housing electrical distribution systems for the East Wing. Historical wiring dating to the 1960s, maintained and patched over decades but never comprehensively replaced, shows evidence of catastrophic failure. Insulation breakdown led to a short circuit, arcing that ignited surrounding combustible materials. Fires spread rapidly through walls and floors before detection systems registered the problem, aided by the building's age. Victorian construction, while solid, created pathways for fire to travel rapidly. Wooden floors, panelled walls, and accumulated dust and debris in wall spaces provided ideal conditions for the flames. As investigators examined maintenance records and interviewed estate staff, more troubling findings emerged. Sandringham's electrical systems had been under ongoing assessment for years, with multiple reports from qualified electricians noting that full rewiring of the east wing was urgent but repeatedly deferred. Partly this was due to cost. Comprehensive rewiring of a historic building is enormously expensive, partly because the east wing saw limited use and therefore seemed lower priority than more frequently occupied sections. The most recent assessment, completed 7 months before the fire, explicitly recommended immediate rewiring, noting that continued use presented an escalating fire risk. This risk would increase each winter as heating loads stressed the aging infrastructure. The recommendation had been reviewed by estate management and flagged for the next budget cycle, meaning work would potentially begin in spring 2025, several months after the tragedy. The decision to defer, while practical from a management perspective, was not legally negligent. It followed standard capital planning processes for large estates where maintenance needs constantly compete for limited funding. But in hindsight, knowing that Margaret Thornton and James Whitmore died because of electrical failure in a system identified as high risk, which sparked a catastrophic fire, the deferral feels unconscionable. Station Commander Hayes's preliminary report, delivered to Charles privately before being released to investigating authorities, makes this clear. The fire was preventable, caused by known infrastructure issues that had not been adequately addressed. Charles receives this report in the Wood Farm study on January 22nd, 3 days before the memorial service. Reading it is physically difficult. His hands shake as he processes that 2 people died because work, which estate management had deemed too expensive or too disruptive to perform immediately, might have prevented the electrical failure that killed them. The report doesn't assign legal culpability. That determination will come from subsequent investigations by Norfolk Police and the Health and Safety Executive. But the moral culpability is inescapable. His home, his staff, his estate management decisions, indirectly made through advisors and professionals, prioritized budget concerns over electrical safety. William finds his father after Charles has read the report, sitting motionless with the document in his lap, staring at nothing. When William asks what the investigation found, Charles tells him quietly that the fire was preventable, caused by electrical systems identified as high risk, which were allowed to remain in service because comprehensive replacement was expensive and seemed non-urgent. William reads the report himself, processing the same guilt and recognition that this tragedy stemmed from institutional decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but now appear catastrophically inadequate. The Prince of Wales considers his own properties, Kensington Palace and Mahal, and wonders what maintenance issues exist in those historic buildings that are being managed rather than resolved, and what deferred maintenance might become the next tragedy. Princess Anne's response to the investigation findings is characteristically direct. She tells Charles bluntly that he cannot take personal responsibility for every estate management decision made by professional staff, that the deferral of electrical work followed standard processes and wasn't negligent in the legal or practical sense, but she also acknowledges that the outcome is unbearable. Regardless of process, 2 people are dead because infrastructure maintenance was inadequate, and the royal family's reputation for maintaining properties to the highest standards has been revealed as aspirational rather than actual. The institution will need to respond with more than sympathy. Comprehensive safety reviews of all royal properties, commitment to prioritizing infrastructure maintenance regardless of cost, and transparent acknowledgement that standard capital planning processes proved insufficient. The investigation findings leaked to media within days, inevitable given the number of people involved in the official investigation. Headlines shift from a tragic accident narrative to more critical analysis. Fire investigators identified deferred maintenance as a factor in Sandringham deaths. Electrical systems flagged as high risk months before the fatal fire. Questions emerge about royal estate safety standards. Coverage is generally respectful of the victims and sympathetic to the royal family. But an underlying current emerges questioning whether cost considerations or bureaucratic inertia contributed to preventable deaths. The Thornton and Whitmore families, learning through media that electrical problems were known and deferred, begin asking harder questions about accountability and whether their loved ones died because safety concerns were given insufficient priority. By January 24th, Charles decides the preliminary investigation findings must be addressed publicly before the memorial service. The palace releases a statement acknowledging that electrical infrastructure issues contributed to the fire, that these issues had been identified in assessment reports, and that with devastating hindsight, immediate remediation should have been prioritized regardless of cost or disruption. The statement announces comprehensive safety reviews of all royal properties, immediate implementation of any urgent infrastructure improvements, regardless of budget implications, and commitment to full transparency with investigating authorities regarding Sandringham's maintenance history. Most significantly, the statement includes personal words from the King expressing his devastation that preventable infrastructure failure cost Margaret Thornton and James Whitmore their lives, and his commitment to ensuring their deaths lead to meaningful change in how royal properties are maintained and protected. The statement is remarkable for its directness. Royal communications typically avoid anything resembling admission of fault, preferring carefully neutral language that acknowledges circumstances without accepting responsibility. But Charles insists on clarity, telling communications staff that obfuscation and protocol matter less than honest acknowledgement that people died because his estate's maintenance priorities were inadequate. The statement won't bring Margaret and James back, nor ease their family's grief. But perhaps it provides some small comfort that their deaths are being taken seriously and will drive genuine institutional change rather than being quietly managed and forgotten. The memorial on January 25th dawns cold and clear over Sandringham, the Norfolk countryside frozen and beautiful, despite the tragedy that has transformed this private royal retreat into a site of mourning. St. Mary Magdalene Church, the stone parish church where 6 generations of royals have worshipped during Norfolk stays, fills quietly with mourners. Family members of Margaret Thornton and James Whitmore, close friends, royal household staff, and senior members of the royal family come to honour 2 lives cut short by preventable tragedy. The service is private, with no media presence beyond a single official photographer whose images will be released to document the event without transforming it into public spectacle. Charles arrives early, accompanied by Camilla and William, all dressed in formal mourning attire. He specifically requested to greet the Thornton and Whitmore families before the service, a departure from protocol that would typically keep the monarch separate until formal proceedings. Sarah Thornton and her children arrive first, and Charles approaches them with visible emotion, expressing personally what his formal letters could only approximate: that Margaret was valued, that her loss affects him deeply, and that he carries guilt for her death in his home. Sarah accepts his condolences with composure that barely conceals anger and grief, thanking him for coming, but maintaining distance that reflects her complicated feelings about mourning her mother in the presence of the family she served when that service cost her life. Richard and Susan Whitmore arrive looking shattered, having aged years in the 11 days since their son's death. Charles embraces Richard before speaking, a breach of protocol that feels necessary, expressing devastation at James's loss and acknowledging that no words or gestures can make this remotely acceptable. Susan asks him directly, her voice breaking, whether the investigation is complete, whether they'll know definitively what caused the fire, and whether anything could have prevented James's death. Charles tells her truthfully that preliminary findings indicate electrical failure in aging systems, that a comprehensive investigation continues, and that she and Richard will receive full transparency about the findings. He does not mention that those findings already indicate the fire was preventable and that deferred maintenance contributed to their son's death. That revelation will come later, when they are ready to hear it. The service begins at 11 a.m. with hymns chosen by the families and readings celebrating lives dedicated to service and quiet excellence. The Dean of Sandringham delivers a homily about Margaret and James that avoids empty platitudes. Instead, he honestly acknowledges the tragedy of lives cut short, the grief that fills this church, and the complicated reality of mourning people who died serving others. He speaks about Margaret's 18 years at Sandringham, her dedication and warmth, and James's enthusiasm and bright future, emphasizing that their deaths occurred in circumstances that should not have occurred, that preventable infrastructure failure cost them their lives, and that the institution they served carries responsibility for ensuring meaningful change. Charles requested to speak. Another protocol departure initially resisted by palace advisers, but insisted upon by the king. He approaches the lectern after the dean's homily, delivering remarks written himself. He speaks about meeting Margaret during early visits to Sandringham, her kindnesses, and James's enthusiasm and dedication. He addresses the hard truth. These two people died in his home. That preliminary investigation indicates infrastructure issues should have been addressed, and that he carries personal grief and guilt for the loss that occurred under his roof. His remarks are brief but powerful, abandoning royal distance in favour of honest emotion. Charles's voice breaks multiple times, forcing pauses to regain composure. When he acknowledges that Margaret and James died because safety concerns weren't adequately prioritised, some mourners visibly react. Sarah Thornton crying openly, the Whitmore parents gripping each other tightly. Charles concludes by promising comprehensive safety reviews across all royal properties, that infrastructure maintenance will be prioritised regardless of cost, and that Margaret and James's service will be honoured not just with words, but with concrete action. Soon he returns to his seat beside Camilla, who takes his hand. Both cry quietly as the service continues with final hymns and prayers. The burial services are separate and private. Margaret Thornton interred in Norwich, where she lived her entire life, James Whitmore in Hampshire near his family home, Charles attending both with Anne standing by in cold January cemeteries. As two people who served his household are laid to rest, the burials are impossibly sad, made worse by the knowledge that these deaths were preventable, that different priorities or faster action might have meant Margaret and James lived to see spring. The king, who has spent his life in positions of power and privilege, stands helpless before grief and loss that all his resources cannot undo. Sir Clive Alderton wakes from sedation on January 25th. His condition stabilised enough to allow consciousness, and his first questions are about the fire, about staff members, about whether everyone escaped safely. Elizabeth must tell her husband that Margaret Thornton and James Whitmore died while he survived, that the building he was working in became their tomb. Clive's response is devastation, silence, tears, and then determination that when he's recovered enough, he will personally ensure that every maintenance issue in every royal property is addressed immediately, regardless of cost or inconvenience. Elizabeth tells him gently that he's not responsible, that he couldn't have prevented this, but they both know the guilt he will carry regardless. Survivor's guilt compounded by institutional guilt, as systems and priorities he helped manage proved inadequate. By February, Sandringham remains closed to the royal family. The damaged East Wing is a ruin, awaiting decisions about demolition or reconstruction. Charles has not returned since the memorial service, finding the estate too painful to visit, memories of that night pervading every room and corridor. Comprehensive safety reviews are underway at Windsor, Buckingham Palace, Kensington Palace, and other royal properties, examining electrical systems, fire suppression, emergency evacuation procedures, and maintenance priorities with renewed urgency. The reviews are expensive and disruptive, but that expense and disruption now seem trivial compared to lives lost because similar work was deferred at Sandringham. The official investigation by Norfolk Police and the Health and Safety Executive continues, with final reports expected by late spring. Preliminary indications suggest no criminal negligence. Maintenance deferral followed standard capital planning processes and didn't constitute reckless disregard for safety. But the moral culpability remains, and the royal family's response acknowledges that legal adequacy doesn't equal moral sufficiency. Margaret Thornton and James Whitmore died because systems that should have protected them weren't adequate, and that reality demands more than a legal minimum response. By March, Charles had established memorial funds in both names, supporting causes they cared about and providing ongoing financial assistance to their families. The funds are meaningful but feel inadequate against the enormity of loss. Money cannot resurrect the dead or ease grief, but it is what the institution can offer alongside its commitment to ensuring deferred maintenance never again costs lives, that infrastructure safety becomes an absolute priority, and that Margaret and James's deaths drive genuine change rather than being quietly forgotten. Once initial grief fades, Sandringham will eventually be repaired. The East Wing rebuilt with modern systems and comprehensive safety features. But for Charles, the estate is forever transformed from a private retreat into a site of tragedy and guilt. The building where 6 generations of his family found peace and privacy is now the place where 2 people died because priorities weren't adequate and systems weren't sufficient. That reality cannot be rebuilt or repaired, only acknowledged and carried forward as motivation for ensuring such tragedy never happens again. This fictional narrative explores how privilege and power cannot prevent tragedy, and how institutions must respond when preventable failures cost lives. The fire at Sandringham reveals that even royal resources cannot ensure safety when maintenance is deferred and infrastructure is aging. Subscribe for more stories examining the human cost behind institutional failures. Like and share if this resonated, because even palaces burn when safety becomes negotiable. Comment your thoughts below. Let us know what you think about how institutions handle preventable tragedies.